Hey everybody, Geoff Blake here. Welcome to CSS-based layouts in Dreamweaver Part 2. This video is brought to you by CreativBits, creativebits.org, the Apple-oriented design community. Be sure to check them out. In Part 1, you got the basics of creating a CSS-based layout. Now we're going to further refine that layout with nested divs, so let's get right to it. So where we left off is we had refreshed our browser and we saw our beautiful full-color divs inside Firefox. So check this out. We've drawn our three divs, right? No big deal. Now, I'm going to go over to the side here. I'm looking for my CSS Styles panel. If you don't see your CSS Styles panel, head to your window menu, and you might have to expand style here, and lo and behold, you find your three divs. Now, not exactly. You don't find the divs themselves. What you find are the CSS rules that control your divs. Wrap your melon around that. So each of these divs is under the control of a CSS rule. It's pretty cool. So when I went and named my divs earlier, I was actually naming the rules that control the divs. All right. So for example, I select header here in the CSS Styles panel, and down towards the bottom inside the properties area, I can see the values that I've set for these rules. There's my background color, there's my height, there's some of my positioning values, the top and the left and the width and the height and so on, and a couple of other things as well. So I hope that makes sense. What happens is as soon as you draw out a div in Dreamweaver using the method that we did, using that insert bar, bang-o, right away Dreamweaver's creating these rules for you. So it's pretty well taken care of for you in Dreamweaver. Now, of course, we could dig into this even further if we wanted to. I could take my header here, for example, and double-click on them. And that brings me into the CSS Rule Definition for header. By the way, I didn't point this out earlier. Notice that each of my rules is preceded by a number sign. That's how I know that these three rules control objects, control divs on my page. Pretty cool. So I double click on this guy, brings me into this dialog box here. You've probably been in this dialog box before in Dreamweaver. And obviously I have all my different categories for the rule here. So for example, what I could do is I could get into like controlling the font inside an entire div, or setting a border for the div, or who knows what, right? But let me show you this. I'm going to go down to positioning. There's my width, there's my height, there's the X and Y we were talking about earlier, the top and the left. But what I wanted to point out was this type setting here. The default here is absolute. That's what they mean, by the way, by AP div, absolute positioning div, right? But my argument has always been, hey, they're all divs regardless as to the actual positioning type that's used. And you can see there's 4 of them here. So I would highly suggest that if you have the time, read up on these different positioning types, because you can do some pretty wild things. Anyway, I'll leave that up to you. I'm just going to cancel out of this here. All right, cool stuff. Now, I want to show you something else. I want to show you how to put a div inside another div. This is what we call a nested div. If you've ever worked with nested tables before, same kind of idea. So what I want to do is inside my main content div here, this green div, I've decided I want to put a menu going down this left-hand side here. Maybe I'll throw in some buttons in there later on or something like that, right? So there's a couple of different ways that you could do this. I want to show you a little bit of code here, so I hope you're up for some code. I'm going to single-click anywhere inside this main div here, inside my green div, and then I'm going to flip over into my code view in Dreamweaver. There we are. Now notice a couple of things. Up at the top of your code, there's all of your rules. Number sign header, number sign content, number sign footer, right? So hopefully all good. So I got to mention something here real quick. When you're drawing out these AP divs, or when you're drawing out these divs in Dreamweaver, not only is Dreamweaver creating the rule for you right away, but it's also creating those rules inside what we call an internal style sheet. I don't know if you've gotten this far or not with Dreamweaver and with CSS, but you have 2 different types of style sheets. What's called an internal style sheet and an external style sheet. So just know that these guys are in an internal style sheet, which means that these rules only apply to the current document, right? This is not a site-wide style sheet like an external style sheet, right? So if you know about external style sheets, you'd probably want to take these rules that Dreamweaver's creating for you and get them out of this internal style sheet and drop them into your external style sheet. Anyway, so just know what's going on there. Now, I'm going to scroll down towards the bottom here. Check this out. There's my 3 divs that Dreamweaver created for me. That's all the code that's needed to create this huge, massive layout. Well, that isn't 100% accurate because I still need all the code up at the top with my 3 styles. But what we're after is I went and moved my cursor. If you didn't move your cursor, it should still be inside this div right here. See how it has, there's the div, open angle bracket, div, and then id equals content. Imagine this little guy here is a reference up to this guy here. So he knows which rule to follow, which rule controls the div, right? That's the connection between the div and the CSS side, okay? So a div is HTML. This little doohickey here is CSS, and that's how the two connect up. All right, so what I need to do is make sure that my cursor is right inside this content div here. So before we came into the code view, I had you click inside the content div. So if you haven't moved your cursor, perfect. You should be in the right spot. I've been showing you stuff and moving my cursor around and so on. Now, this is what I would suggest. Hit enter a couple of times. Give yourself a little bit of elbow room inside here, right? If you know anything about code, you know that white space doesn't really matter. So as a matter of fact, I'm going to kind of clean things up here a little bit just so you can follow along with what I'm doing. Okay, there we go. So there's my header up at the top, footer down at the bottom. And there's my content div right there. I'm going to make sure my cursor's right inside there, anywhere inside there. Now what I want to do is drop another div inside this content div. So here's what you do. You could go back and use the insert bar, which we did before. You've already seen that. So I'm going to go a different route. I'm going to go to my insert menu up at the top. Look for layout objects. Look for div tag. You'll come into this dialog box here. Now, I'm going to click on New CSS Style. I wind up in this dialog box, which you may have seen before. And I got to make sure, a couple of things here. I got to make sure my selector type is set to advanced. The name for my selector is going to be $menu. Now, your selector has to be preceded by a number sign, okay? The other thing, too, I would suggest this document only for now. This is your internal style sheet versus your external style sheet, right? Create them all internally and then boot them into an external style sheet later on, right? All right, good stuff. Hit OK. You wind up back here. Remember, we were just here not too long ago. This is kind of like a back door into this dialog box, right? All right, now head to your positioning category. Set the positioning type to absolute. And then I would throw in the dimensions for the menu object that I'm going to try and create. So I go back and refer to the layout that I already built on paper or in Photoshop or wherever. So I've decided that my width is going to be 100 pixels. It's already set to pixels there for me. And my height is going to be 450. That's the height of that main content div, if you recall. For the positioning, I'll set the top to 0 and the left to 0. Again, that's my X and Y. The only other thing I'm going to do to make sure I can actually see this guy is throw in a background color. So background category, background color, pick a color. Doesn't really matter which color. Obviously, all these background colors are going to be removed as soon as I'm ready to throw in my content, right? All right, good stuff. Click on OK. OK one more time. Check out our code. There it is right there. We have a new div who has an ID that's equal to menu. And then we get some dummy content in here. Content for ID menu goes here. So if I scroll up towards the top, there's my CSS rule for my menu. There's my background color, my positioning type, width, height, and so on. All right, so I hope that makes sense. Okay, let's head back to the design view. There's my menu. I'm going to save this guy. Double check it inside my browser. I already have the page open in my browser, so I just need to refresh. There's my menu. Awesome. So there you go. There's how to create nested divs in Dreamweaver. You can create as many nested divs, or of course you could go even further nesting and nesting your divs. It all depends on what your layout requires, right? What I have found over the years is I call it working from the general to the specific. So here's my general layout blocks that I created with you not too long ago. Now I'm starting to get a little bit more specific with menus, and maybe I decide I want to have some ads over here on the other side and some additional content, right? So I start refining the layout even more and more and more, right? So I find that's easiest for me anyway. Now in part 3, you're going to see how we can take this entire layout and center it inside our web browser. So make sure you check that out, and I will catch up with you then.